What's the most unbelievable coincidence you've ever experienced? Mail story 1. The summer sun beat down on my driveway as I set up for the yard sale. I'd decided to finally part with some old records, hoping someone else might give them the life they deserved. I'd lined them up on a dusty old table, between some chipped mugs and mismatched cutlery. People drifted in, poking through the piles, nodding politely or asking the occasional price. Late morning, an older guy wandered up. He had that kind of quiet, slow walk, like he was in no rush for anything anymore. His eyes skimmed over the clutter, but when he saw the stack of records, something seemed to flicker in his face. He paused, leaned in, and asked if I had the Woodstock album. I told him I did, but it wasn't for sale. It was a bit of a collector's piece to me, one of those things that just sat on a shelf, gathering dust but too nostalgic to part with. But the guy seemed different. He started telling me how he had been at Woodstock all those years ago. Not just a wide-eyed kid in the crowd, but someone who met his future wife there. He said they danced in the mud, shared some laughs, and somehow that wild mess of a festival turned into a lifelong partnership. When they bought the record after it came out, it became this small, sacred token of that chaotic weekend. But life moved fast, and somewhere along the way, he lost it. 30 years ago, he said. His wife had passed a few years back, and all he wanted now was that record to hold on to those memories. I listened, leaning against the garage door, feeling something tug at me. So I went inside, grabbed the album off my shelf, and handed it to him. Told him, "Here, just take it." He stared at it, turning it over in his hands like he was handling something fragile. Then, his eyes locked on the cover, and he froze. His finger traced over a name scrawled faintly on the back. His name. He kept rubbing at it like he couldn't believe it was still there. His own faded handwriting from decades ago. It was his actual record. I felt my skin prickle as he held it up to me, that old, worn sleeve trembling in his hands. The thing had somehow traveled across time and distance. Lost in Toronto, picked up by me in London, Ontario years later, only to find its way back to him. Right on the 50th anniversary of the festival. He clutched it close like he'd found an old friend he thought was gone forever. I just watched him walk away, album tucked under his arm, disappearing down the street like he was taking a piece of the past with him. Female story 2. When I was a kid, maybe around 9 or 10, I'd be sprawled out on the living room floor after school, remote in hand, glued to whatever nonsense was on TV. My mom would be in the kitchen, making some dinner, hollering at me to turn the volume down. It was always a circus, her clanging pots and pans, and me pretending I couldn't hear her over the noise. But whenever that Sunny D commercial came on, the one with that blonde-haired kid flying down the street on his BMX, laughing like he owned the world, I'd go dead silent. I was hooked. That boy, with his stupid bike tricks and sun-kissed hair, was everything my nerdy, braces-wearing self dreamed of. My mom would peek her head around the corner, see that goofy grin plastered on my face, and chuckle, "Oh, look, there's your boyfriend again." I'd roll my eyes, but secretly, I was over the moon every time he popped up on screen. I must have seen that commercial 1,000 times. Flash forward nearly 2 decades, and life wasn't exactly playing out like one of those happy commercials. At 27, I was untangling myself from a messy divorce. My mom was in and out of hospitals, and I was juggling bills, grief, and an apartment that seemed to shrink every day. A perpetual gray cloud hung over everything, but I couldn't just sit in it. So, I did the only thing that made sense to a desperate, lonely, semi-heartbroken person. I downloaded a dating app. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a distraction, but I matched with this guy. Dark hair, Scruffy beard, decent smile. We hit it off. Conversations flowed, light and easy with just enough wit to keep me intrigued. He lived a bit far, like 30 miles out, but hell, at this point, what was I clinging to? We started meeting up, grabbing drinks, hitting dive bars with sticky floors and questionable jukeboxes. Somewhere between cheap beers and late-night drives, he mentioned he used to be a child actor. He listed off commercials like they were old football stats. Saturn cars, some toy bear, a cheesy anti-drug ad. Then, like a lightning bolt, he casually mentioned a Sunny D commercial. My ears perked up so fast I almost choked on my drink. I laughed, telling him about my ridiculous crush on that kid on the BMX bike. He just stared, squinting, like he was trying to place me somewhere in his past. "Yeah," he said, almost like he didn't believe it himself. Yeah. I didn't even know what to say. Here was this grown man, a bit rough around the edges, sitting across from me, and yet all I could see was that grinning kid from my childhood. Life had come full circle in a way I couldn't explain. We kept dating, and things got serious. I moved into his place, which smelled like old wood and cheap cologne, and slowly we started building something new from the ashes of whatever our pasts had been. We got married a couple of years later in a small ceremony. My mom wasn't there, but I swear every time the sun shines just right, it's like she's winking at me. Funny how things go. That kid I once daydreamed about while eating cereal on my living room floor ended up becoming the father of my kids. Life, man. It's a twisted, beautiful mess. Male story 3. The Georgia summers used to drag on forever, that sticky heat thick enough to choke on. It was the kind of place where people drifted in for a season or two, mostly kids looking for a quick paycheck or an adventure before heading back to college or wherever they came from. We had a ragtag bunch every summer, faces changing like the tides. One year, this kid showed up from Canada. Young, scrappy, full of energy that made the sweltering days a little lighter. He had this way of fitting in fast, like he'd always been there. Not long after, he found himself a local girl, and they tied the knot quicker than anyone expected. Good for him, I thought. He seemed happy enough, carving out a life where the rest of us just clocked in and out. But then, a couple of years later, I heard the news. An accident. Gone just like that. The air seemed to get heavier that day, the Georgia sun somehow hotter. Years went by and I'd moved on too. Met a guy from Canada, packed up my life, and found myself living on a farm in a place so remote in Ontario it felt like the edge of the world. It was all rolling fields, dense forests, and a handful of neighbors scattered miles apart. We sold honey, veggies, crafts, whatever kept the farm running. One crisp fall day, we set up at a tiny fair in the closest town, more like a big backyard with a few tents than an actual event. The smell of hay and caramelized apples hung in the air, kids running wild between booths. We were busy selling honey when this older couple shuffled up, all gray hair and worn hands. They looked like they'd been farming their whole lives, faces weathered like old leather. The woman picked up a jar of honey, and I could see her squinting at me. "Where are you from?" she asked after a beat. I told her, "Georgia." Her eyes widened. "They had a son who lived in Georgia once," she said, "but he'd passed away." My heart stuttered for a second. I knew before she even finished talking, their boy was that kid, the one who'd stayed behind when the rest of us left, the one who never got to leave Georgia. We stood there surrounded by laughter and music, and yet it felt like the world had gone silent. They'd peppered me with questions, desperate for scraps of a story I hadn't thought of in years, details about his time there, the job he'd worked, the friends he had made. The whole scene felt surreal, the small-town fair, the smell of earth and leaves, and here I was, somehow, the missing link between their son's past life and the aching hole he left behind. By the time they walked away, their eyes glistened. They clutched that jar of honey like it was something precious. I watched them disappear into the crowd, feeling the strangeness of it all sink into my bones. A chance meeting in the middle of nowhere, years and miles from where it all began. Mail story 4. So, it's around midnight, and I'm hunched over my laptop, eyes straining from staring at the screen for way too long. I've been chatting with this person on Reddit for a few days now, all casual stuff, shared hobbies, swapping recommendations, that kind of thing. But tonight, for some reason, the conversation takes a left turn into personal territory. Maybe it's the late hour loosening us up, or just that comfort you get with someone online, where you feel like you're spilling secrets to a stranger you'll never meet. We start swapping stories, mentioning places we've lived. The usual, right? I say, I used to live in Open Lynn, and they come back with, no way, me too. I think, okay, cool, not that uncommon. But then, when we start narrowing it down, it turns out we lived in the same neighborhood, same damn streets even. They go, wait, were you there around 2000? And my brain kind of skips a beat because, yeah, I was. Things get weird, but in that kind of thrilling way where you're half convinced someone's pulling your leg, but you can't stop chasing the rabbit down the hole. I mentioned I went to this one park all the time, playing baseball with the other neighborhood kids. And there's a long pause. I can almost feel them leaning closer to their screen. Then they hit me with, did you play ball at quarterfinals? And I swear, my spine tingles. I spent entire summers there, swatting at curveballs and striking out more times than I care to remember. I'm thinking, there's no way. But I go with it. Yeah, I say, practically lived there back in the day. That's when they hit me with the kicker. They say, do you remember this one game where some kid hit a foul ball straight into the windshield of a parked car? And man, my memory unlocks like a rusted old gate. I remember it so vividly. A humid summer afternoon, sweat plastering my hair to my forehead, and this wild swing that sent the ball flying right into the street. That crunch of glass, the way the whole game just stopped, everyone frozen, like we were all about to get grounded for life. Turns out, that was them. They were on the other team. And just like that, I'm sitting there, staring at my screen like it's grown a second head. The same kid I probably heckled from the dugout a dozen years ago is now swapping memes with me in the dead of night on Reddit. Neither of us remembered the other's face, but somehow the chaos of that one busted windshield tied us back together, years later across screens and cities. It's nuts. This whole thing started with a couple of upvotes and some throwaway messages, and suddenly I'm thrown back to a summer where my biggest worry was getting that curveball right. Mail story 5. I'm sitting there propped up on an old desk chair in my parents' house, the kind that creaks if you even breathe too hard. It's way past midnight, the rest of the house dead quiet, everyone's asleep, and I've got the place to myself. I've just finished the last episode of Full Metal Alchemist, still buzzing from how everything wrapped up. You know that kind of show that leaves you just staring at the screen, trying to process all the craziness that went down? Yeah, that was me. The room's dim, just the glow of my ancient laptop screen lighting up the clutter around me. Some old textbooks, a couple of empty soda cans, and, well, mess of cables that always seem to knot themselves when you're not looking. I'm feeling the aftershock of the series, all hyped up. So I do that iconic move, just messing around. I clap my hands together like they do in the show and slam them hard on the desk. The wood rattles, a pen rolls off the edge, and suddenly, boom, everything goes pitch black. No hum of electronics, no flicker of the laptop's glow, just dead silence and darkness. For a second, I'm frozen, like I've just accidentally broken the universe. My eyes strain to adjust, but it's the kind of black where you can't even see your own hands in front of your face. I stand up, knocking my knee against the corner of the desk, swearing under my breath, and I start fumbling my way out of the room. I stumble down the hallway, fingers tracing the wall so I don't trip on something stupid like my dad's boots he always leaves lying around. The whole house is out. Fridge, microwave, even the street lights outside. It's like the whole world just cut out. I make it to the breaker box in the basement, cold concrete under my bare feet, flipping switches like a man possessed. Nothing. Eventually, after what feels like an hour but is probably only 10 minutes, the power sputters back on like nothing ever happened. Lights flicker, and the house comes back to life with a low hum. But that moment sticks with me, like I'd somehow short-circuited the entire block with a single clap. I don't mess with that move again, not because I think it'll happen twice, but because, honestly, I don't really want to test it. Mail Story 6 Sundays in our house meant countdown on the TV and mugs of tea cooling on the coffee table. My mom and I, hunched over cushions on the worn-out sofa, would make a sport of guessing those blasted 9-letter words. I'd gotten into the habit of shouting, "cardboard," before they even flashed the letters on the screen, a little family joke that had been running for, I don't know, years. It wasn't even about being right. It was just my thing. I'd yell it out, she'd roll her eyes, and the game would move on. It was like clockwork. One rainy afternoon, the kind where the windows fog up and the whole house smells of damp wool and toast, we were parked in front of the TV again. The final round came up, and for no reason at all, I decided to switch it up. I was feeling bold or bored, who knows. I blurted out, "wardrobes," instead, just to change the script. Mum raised an eyebrow, but didn't say a word. She just took another sip of her lukewarm tea and settled back into her cushion, ready for the letters to roll. The clock started ticking. The letters came up in that usual jumbled mess. I squinted, trying to rearrange them in my head. Mom kept her eyes glued to the screen, chewing her lip, like she always did when she got in her zone. I couldn't make heads or tails of it, though. Nothing seemed to fit. My mind was blank, like trying to solve a crossword after one too many pints. The buzzers sounded, and the contestants looked as stumped as we were. Then, the reveal. The letters flipped over, one by one, and there it was. Cardboard. I just sat there, my mouth hanging open. Mom let out a laugh, that deep belly kind that only comes out when life throws you the kind of curveball you never see coming. All those years of me shouting cardboard like a broken record, and the one time I decided to switch it up, it actually turned out to be the answer. What were the odds? The TV droned on to the next segment, but we were still sitting there, shaking our heads in disbelief. Mom just nudged me with her elbow, that silent "told you so" kind of nudge, and I couldn't even argue back. Sometimes the universe plays a game you don't even know you're in. Mail Story 7. I was exhausted, jet-lagged, and starving after that cramped flight into Heathrow. The air smelled damp, like the city had just shrugged off a rainstorm. I dragged my suitcase along cobbled streets, not really knowing where the hell I was going, but trying to keep up appearances, looking like I knew what I was doing. Typical tourist move, right? The streets twisted and turned like someone had spilled spaghetti on a map. I picked a direction at random, turning left and then right, trying to lose myself in the maze of London. The buildings leaned in, tight and old, their brick facades grimy and timeless. The city's energy buzzed in my ears, a mix of honking cabs, impatient footfalls, and the distant chime of Big Ben somewhere beyond the foggy skyline. I had no itinerary, no grand plans. Just a vague notion to find a decent pub, grab a pint, and blend in with the locals for a bit. But first, I needed to stretch my legs. So I walked, each corner promising something new, something distinctly London. Red telephone boxes, Union Jacks fluttering lazily, the whole cliché package. Then I turned another corner, and that's when it happened. A massive, red double-decker bus hissed to a stop right in front of me, blocking my way. I paused, annoyed at the unexpected obstacle, tapping my fingers against the suitcase handle. The doors clattered open and the usual stream of harried commuters spilled out, heads down, earbuds in, not paying attention to anyone. But there, stepping off that bus like he'd been dropped from the sky, was Dan. Dan, the only person I knew in this sprawling, indifferent city of millions. We made eye contact instantly. It was like a jolt of static electricity. He was the last person I expected to see, mostly because I hadn't even told him I was here. He just stood there, as stunned as I was, with the red bus roaring away behind him. His face was frozen in a mix of disbelief and confusion, like he'd just seen a ghost. I couldn't even move, just stared. The crowd funneled around us, pushing, shoving, muttering in that distinctly British way of letting you know you're in their way. But for that moment, it was like the whole city had hit pause, the chaos of London grinding to a halt, just for us. Dan shook his head, blinked hard like he was trying to reset his vision. He looked just the same as when I last saw him years ago. Same scruffy jacket, same lopsided grin. It was like no time had passed, and yet here we were, in the middle of this foreign city, intersecting lives for no good reason. No one would have believed it if I tried to explain it. The odds of us crossing paths here, of all places. But there it was. London's sprawling mess brought the two of us together with a damn bus. Female story 8. The first day of 8th grade hit like a sledgehammer. New school, new faces, a fresh round of trying to figure out where to fit in. I dragged my sneakers across the scuffed tile floor of the hallway, searching for room 204. Math class. The bell hadn't rung yet, but the chatter inside that classroom was already a roar. I shoved the door open, scanning the rows for an empty seat, and that's when I saw him. Jesse. He was sitting there, slouched in his chair, the same shaggy brown hair and freckled nose I remembered from elementary school. My heart skipped. We hadn't seen each other in years, not since my family packed up and moved to a town 2 hours away. We hadn't kept in touch. Kids that age don't. You lose track, lose numbers, and move on. But there he was, as if no time had passed at all. I didn't hesitate. I walked straight over, dropped my bag on the desk next to him, and grinned like a damn fool. He looked up, eyes widening, then broke into the same goofy smile that I remembered. It was like slipping back into an old pair of sneakers. Comfortable, no awkwardness. We picked up right where we left off, like we'd never spent those years apart. From that day on, Jesse and I were inseparable again. We'd hang out after school, get into the kind of dumb, reckless adventures that make middle school the chaotic mess it's supposed to be. High school rolled around, and somehow, somewhere along the way, that easy friendship blurred into something else. I guess it was inevitable. All those late nights talking on the phone, the shared secrets, the endless laughter. It turned into something deeper. We started dating sophomore year, and by senior prom, we were already talking about forever like we knew what that even meant. Years later, with 3 kids running wild in our house and bills to pay, Jesse dove into this rabbit hole of genealogy, a hobby he called it. But you know how those things go. It became an obsession. He'd stay up till the early hours, sifting through ancient records and dusty family trees online. I mostly rolled my eyes at it, until one night he burst out of his office with this wild look in his eyes. He'd found something. Turns out, his great-grandparents and my great-grandparents had been next-door neighbors back in Germany. They'd lived side by side in this cramped gray building in a tiny town neither of us could pronounce properly. Both families had packed up and left, chasing dreams across the Atlantic. They ended up in completely different corners of the United States, never crossing paths again. Decades passed, and by some ridiculous twist of fate, Their great-grandkids found their way back to each other in a middle school math class. Looking back, it feels like the universe was playing some long, complicated game of connect the dots. All these separate lives, moving, shifting, colliding, until everything just snapped into place.